Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to go over the next metaphysical law for the chapter. So I call this law the law of spiritual relativity, not to be confused with special and general relativity, right? So we're actually going to talk about that. As the name suggests, they're going to be very closely related, right? So in this video, what I want to now address is I want to address a phenomena that we notice in spiritual experiences that kind of is difficult for some people to get past, right, as it relates to God and accepting these spiritual experiences as being supernatural, or at least I think a lot of people might still accept them as supernatural, but they may have a hard time sort of knowing what to believe based on them, right? So that's what I want to talk about, and to go over this first point, it says, why do spiritual experiences vary so greatly across religions? Right, so that's an interesting question, right? And this is something we do notice in the reporting patterns of people who have spiritual experiences with God or just religious figures, right? So, for example, Hindus, if they were to claim they had a spiritual experience, they might mention that they saw Vishnu, right? So Vishnu is a very central figure in Hinduism. I don't know too much about Hinduism, but I am aware that Vishnu is a very central figure and a very prominent figure in Hinduism, right? If a Muslim claims that they had a spiritual experience, right, and they saw a religious figure, they might say they saw Muhammad, right? And so on and so forth, right? Buddhists may see Buddha or whoever else they believe in. I don't know their religion that well either. But yeah, so when people have experiences and they have different religious beliefs, they may see a figure, from their religion in this spiritual experience. And for some people, they're uncomfortable with that, right? Because for some people, they believe that if God exists, right, which he does, but for some people, they question it, or they may word it that way, and say if God exists, then why aren't spiritual experiences more consistent, right? Why they should all pretty much affirm a single religion. The fact that they're different says that either God doesn't exist, or, it's just kind of a strange interpretation to have. He could exist and just not follow any religion, or properly be described by any religion, but that is how some people look at it, particularly atheists, right? So they would say that because these spiritual experiences have this inconsistency, right, and they have other inconsistencies at times, right? One experience may say hell exists, one may say it doesn't, right? And so they may say, an atheist would say, well, they would be consistent if these experiences were actually supernatural. Therefore, they must be random sort of experiences that are generated by your brain, right? So they're purely physical phenomena, right? Although we experience them, they're still purely physical, right? So I, of course, don't agree with that at all, right? I don't even really think that makes sense. But, and we talked mostly about that in chapter 2, right? There are many aspects of these spiritual experiences and supernatural experiences, particularly near-death experiences as well. There are many components of experience that I would say would give us reason to believe these definitely aren't sort of physical phenomena, right? If you have a problem with the inconsistency components, there are way more problems, right, with presuming that they're physical phenomena. So for me, even though I believe strongly they're supernatural phenomena, it is still a fair question, right? Why are the spiritual experiences different, right? Or in some cases even seemingly inconsistent, right? And some people, if they want to have a strong relationship with God, they may have trouble getting past that, right? So that's what I want to address in this video, basically that topic, right? And before I go forward, though, there's one other thing I want to mention. So the way I'm going to present these ideas, just as a disclaimer, it's a little different from how I kind of came up with them, right? So I actually came up with them from the spiritual experience that I talked about with sleep apnea, right? So I started noticing, when I was going through that experience, right, there's a lot of spiritual activity around me, right? And so that's what happens when you're kind of in that position. And I started to pick up on certain things that I was seeing in my dream and that I was feeling. And even in that stage, right, because I was going through it, right, in that state, which, like I said, I've talked about before. But even then, I'm still theorizing. I can't help myself, right? So I have to theorize based on things I'm observing, especially as it relates to the subconscious and spiritual, metaphysical activity or spiritual phenomena, right? So around that time, I'm still theorizing. And then I came up with a theory, which is pretty much the beginning of this theory, right? And then I started to understand certain things. I started to recognize certain things happening in my dreams. And I might have talked about that a little bit before, but I started recognizing certain things happening in my dreams. And then I started to form a theory that made predictions, and then so on and so forth, right? And so then I came up with kind of a theory about the nature of the relativity component of the spirit realm, which was what we're going to talk about. We're not going to talk about all of it in this video, but we're going to talk about a good chunk of it. In the next video, we're going to talk about the nature of dreams, which is an application of this law. And then later in the chapter, we'll talk about the third component that I want to talk about. So I just felt the need to give that disclaimer. The way I present these ideas in this video are going to be more presentable. It's going to make the ideas more digestible, I think, right? So to get into it, the main question I want to try to answer in this video is why do, like the question here says, why do spiritual experiences vary so greatly across religions? And they even vary to some degree within religions, right? So why does that happen? Well, in answering this question, right, if I think about this question and I try to come up with an idea of what the answer might be, well, one thing that comes to mind is it reminds me of something that we see in the physical realm, right, in the physical world. So not talking about spirituality or metaphysics, we see it in the world around us, right, the material world, right? So, and I mentioned this many times before, but I'll go over it again, right, for this context. So in special relativity, right, we see a similar phenomena. In special relativity, it is possible, so if an object is moving at a speed comparable to the speed of light, it is possible for many different people, let's imagine, right, this doesn't really happen, but let's imagine, right, that many different people are moving at different speeds. Different people are moving at different speeds that are also comparable to the speed of light, but it's still different speeds, right? And they're maintaining a constant velocity relative to the moving object. It is possible, right, so if we're just looking at non-relativistic parameters, so if we take what's called a non-relativistic kinetic energy, right, it is possible for different people to measure different kinetic energy values. For this, let's say this marker is moving, at constant velocity relative to the speed of light, constant velocity comparable to the speed of light. It's possible for different people to measure this marker with an instrument. So we're not talking about their mind or their beliefs or whatever. They can use a physical instrument and measure this marker in some way, and they can all get different values of the kinetic energy or the non-relativistic kinetic energy. So for example, somebody might measure 5 joules of energy, another person can measure 3 joules, another 4 joules, in 2 joules, and so on, right? Now that doesn't make sense if we really think about it, right? The way we think about energy, right, it's a unique component that is a property of matter, right? It's a property of some object, right? So it's a property of some object. So if this object is moving, we presume that it has a fixed amount of kinetic energy. It doesn't have 5 joules of energy and 6 joules and 7 and 2 joules and 3 joules and things like that. It doesn't have all of them at the same time. That doesn't make any sense, right? How could this have different values of kinetic energy, significantly different values of kinetic energy all at the same time, right? And we actually saw something like that with quantum mechanics, right? It is possible for a quantum particle to have different values of energy at the same time when it's in a state of superposition. That's before you measure it. But that's a quantum particle, right? That doesn't happen at all with macroscopic objects. So if this object is moving and I'm able to measure it using an instrument, macroscopic instrument, right, and I measure its kinetic energy, it doesn't make sense that, it doesn't make sense if multiple people do that. They all get different kinetic energy values. And what's even crazier, right, is as long as they're maintaining a constant velocity relative to the object, and the object's moving at constant velocity, everything they observe will be consistent with what they measured. But how's that possible? How is this object going to do something that fits that person's observation and that person's observation and that person's observation and is completely consistent? That doesn't make any sense, right? But it is exactly the same thing we see in the spirit realm, right? So in other words, we know these are supernatural phenomena. I believe I can assert that claim, right? So we know they're supernatural phenomena, and many different people are seeing different things. Is it possible that the object is still, the spiritual experience is still consistent in some way, right? Even though it looks different to different observers. So that's kind of the underlying idea I have as to the answer to this question, right? And so, that's special relativity, right? We can even say the same thing in general relativity, right? Now, general relativity I'm not as familiar with. I haven't had the chance to deeply study it yet. I have had the time to study a little bit, but I need to study more of it. But my understanding with general relativity is, in general relativity, they have something called the equivalence principle. So what the equivalence principle is, or what it says, is that we're basically unable to tell the difference between acceleration that's not due to gravity and acceleration basically due to gravity. So acceleration not due to gravity is just like, generally, the underlying force would be electromagnetism, which is like me pushing something, right? So let's say, for some reason, whatever the reason, right, I'm accelerating this object. Now, I want to know if this object is accelerating due to something not due to gravity, so something's pushing it, or is it accelerating due to the pull of gravity, right? I want to know what force is accelerating it. Now, the equivalence principle in general relativity says that I can't know. Well, it doesn't say you can't know that, right? It says that, I think it says basically for an observer, locally, right? So that has a particular definition, but for the moment I'll just say locally, you can't tell the difference, right? If space is flat. That's what's called flat space. So I can't tell the difference between the two. But I don't want to hear that, right? I want to know if I'm dealing with a gravitational field or just acceleration, right? I don't want to hear that I'm not allowed to know. I don't want to hear that they're equivalent, right? So how do I deal with that problem? Actually, no, before I was going to say that, I was going to say we see the same phenomena, right? We see a similar phenomena with general relativity, right? You can have an object behave in a way that looks the same whether we're dealing with gravitational field or just pure acceleration, and I can't tell the difference, right? So there's a relativity component there. And so how do we, what I was getting at before was, how do we solve this problem, right? How do we solve the problem? Let's say in special relativity, I don't want to hear that, there's 5 different measurements of kinetic energy for this object, right? I want to know what I want to get a single value for kinetic energy, and I want to be able to measure it wherever I am. I don't want to know what velocity I'm moving relative to the object, right? I want one value of energy, and I want to be able to use it whenever I focus on this object, right? In other words, how do I get around this problem of the kinetic energy of the object looking different to me depending on how fast I'm moving or depending on the observer? Well, the way they get around it in special relativity, right, is to, and I talked about it before, it's to use the reference frame of the object itself, right? The reference frame of the object is at rest. And for time-like space-time intervals, or what's called time-like space-time intervals, you would use what's called proper time. So you can use proper time to measure its the total space-time interval, which is basically the distance it travels between 2 points. And using that, you can now set up something called a 4-vector, and none of that's really that important. But you can use that basically to calculate all your values, right? And the reason you could do that is because that's a reference frame everybody can agree upon, right? And so now, as long as everyone is sort of for certain values they get, maybe in their measurement, they can convert it to the reference frame, which is called a Lorentz transformation, right? They can convert it to the reference frame everyone agrees on, when we all can easily access this reference frame and just input our numbers to this frame. And that helps us to get around that problem, right? So we saw that there was a problem where everyone's observing something, but they're all seeing different things. But we saw how there was a way around that, right? And that's by everyone just kind of ignoring what they're observing and just inputting numbers, performing calculations. So we all go to what the person who is in the reference frame with the object at rest is observing. It's like a translational ability. So that's an interesting way of doing it. So we can solve that problem mathematically as it relates to that problem in the physical realm. And what I was going to say earlier is with general relativity, how do you solve the problem if you want to know if an object is accelerating due to gravity or not due to gravity? Well, what Einstein realized, if my memory serves me, right, is that he realized that an object that's accelerating due to gravity is going to have different strains, right? There's going to be strains on the object and stresses on the object that you're not going to get with an acceleration field. With accelerating in a way that's not due to gravity, right? It's going to be different. I believe if it's accelerating due to gravity, there's going to be a unit. You can find a reference frame where the forces on the object are uniform everywhere, I believe, right? So the physicists will have to fact check me. Like I said, I'm not as good at general relativity. But if you can't find a reference frame where the forces are uniform and there's no sort of tension or stress-like forces and strains, if you can't find a single reference frame if you can find at least one where there's none of that, then it's not a gravity field, right? And if you can't find one frame where there's no strain and stresses and it's not a uniform distribution of stresses, then it's a gravity field, right? And that has to do with the nature of how gravity affects the object, but particularly how it bends space, right? So it's always going to bend space. The bending of space is not uniform for almost any distance. So depending on how precise you want to get your measurements, you'll always be able to find strains in which they're not uniform. And if we're local, then there's going to be no strains just due to any type of acceleration that isn't gravity, because it's not bending space, in theory, right? Any acceleration, I believe, technically bends space as a result of special relativity, but if I'm correct, right, the effects are they're very negligible. It takes a lot of mass and energy to get the kind of bending of space-time in acceleration effect from gravity for some significant mass, right? So the differences are going to be if you want to know the difference between acceleration due to something that isn't gravity and gravity, if gravity's moving it, then there's enough mass and energy to cause enough of a difference that it's going to be significantly more than any other acceleration. So that's my understanding, but ultimately that's Einstein's way of getting around this problem, right? Where something can appear to be the same, in this case it appears to do the same thing, right? Due to acceleration not due to gravity and acceleration due to gravity. So we get around this problem by looking for strains. That's the difference. So I say all that to say that can we do something similar with spirituality? So if the spiritual experiences, right, or I should say in this case, right, for special and general relativity, there's a truth, right, that these objects are following that we can't immediately observe, right? We can't tell what that truth is. It takes some work, some effort. It takes some work to find out what that deeper truth is, right? It's not immediately clear based on superficial observation. And that may also be the case here. So we see the same problem, right? We see a phenomena that seems to change depending on the observer, right? Is there some underlying truth that if we just try a little harder, we can get to, right? And we can do it in a way that we can get to that truth and we can recognize that truth regardless of what the observer is actually seeing in a superficial way, right? So I set that whole thing up to kind of set up that idea, right? So when I think about that question and I try to understand what the deeper truth to these spiritual experiences might be, presuming these are coming from God, right, and beings who act on behalf of God, then I think that I want to know the purpose of these experiences first, right? So I feel like I need to know that. I feel like that's going to help me kind of come up with a theory that helps to answer this question. An example of that would be to say, like, let's say I'm working out, right? I want to work out and you see me eating different foods, right? You know I need a lot of protein to work out to build muscle, right? And it's just a super random example, right? But if you see me eating different foods, let's say I'm eating a burger, and I'm eating pizza, then I'm eating chicken, right? And I'm eating cereal, right? And you might say, well, if you want to eat a clean diet with high protein, you should be eating chicken breast and vegetables, right? Like, why aren't you eating that? So a person could ask that question, right? They could ask the question of, why am I eating all of these things if I want to build muscle? I'm not eating the most ideal thing, in other words, right? Well, very simply, I'm not eating for the purpose of building muscle, right? So if I were eating solely for the purpose of building muscle, then yes, I would eat the chicken breast and the vegetables, and I eat a very clean diet and things like that. So when you see me eating all this other stuff, you can imagine my purpose must be something different. In this case, then you can imagine my purpose is probably just to eat solely for pleasure, right? I'm just eating whatever I think tastes the best and puts me in a good mood or whatever, right? And then when you know that's the purpose, then what I'm eating makes sense, right? So like I said, very simple very simple example, but I say that to kind of prove a point, right? That it won't make sense what I'm doing if you don't understand the purpose behind it or underlying it, right? When you understand the purpose underlying what I'm doing, then what I'm doing makes sense. Then you can make sense of this apparent difference in what you kind of expect I should do, but from what I'm actually doing. And so that's kind of how I think of this experience, right? If I think about the purpose, the underlying purpose behind why God is giving us these experiences, maybe I can come up with a theory to get the full truth underlying them. So that's how I like to think about it. And when I think about all near-death experiences and spiritual experiences, I want to, if I'm going to try to understand the purpose, I want to kind of look for something that appears to be in all of them. Some property, some piece of the phenomena, right, that appears to be in almost, if not all experiences. And I say in that way because these are subjectively verifiable phenomena, right? So we talked about in chapter 2 how these phenomena generally are going to come with a person's opinion, with their subjective proclivities, is that the right word, right? Or inclinations, right? And their personal beliefs. And when they're reporting these experiences, we have to ask them for their testimony. They may misremember, they may not articulate their ideas correct, they may lie. So there's always going to be some degree of distortion in terms of the accuracy of the data from subjectively verifiable experiences. That's just it's almost like the uncertainty principle with these types of phenomena, right? It's just a fact of life. There's nothing you can do about it. That's how it is. But that's how we have to study these phenomena through that distortion or that uncertainty. So, getting back to this, we can now ask a question of what appears to be in all of these phenomena, or reported in majority of them, or most of them, a good chunk of them, right? Well, when I think about it, and I study all these near-death experiences and spiritual experiences, and I try to really look for what is the most ubiquitous component of all of them, for what I recognize is that it seems to be a message, right? All spiritual experiences to some degree have a message, and I talked about this in chapter 2. They seem to have a message that tells people or inspires them or motivates them to act in the highest expression of love, right? From looking at these experiences, it seems like God wants us to practice being a good person. God wants us to practice behaving, I couldn't say in the likeness of Jesus Christ, but for the moment I'll just say behaving in the highest expression of love and trying to practice that and making the effort to seek that, right? Every near-death experience, even the hellish ones, right, seem to have that underlying message, right? And this what I was saying before about you would not expect to see this if the materialist model was correct. There should be a good chunk of spiritual experiences where this random sort of archetypical figure in our imagination sort of told us to, indulge in, in our gross desires or whatever, right? That should happen with a fair amount of regularity because it's just something magically in our head and it's just our own sort of thoughts or whatever, right? And if we engage in those behaviors in daily life to some degree, then they should be reflected in our mind and dreams or something, whatever, right? But you don't see that, right? That's a really important component, right? That you should, like I said, see that with a good chunk of regularity. But you don't see it at all, virtually at all. Like that's virtually never said, right? And especially experiences with God, right? In even religious figures, it's virtually always some message of love. It's always against this urge that our bodies should have, or that our bodies do have, but against these urges that we should just feel a strong inclination toward as a result of our body and things like that. So yeah, I just mentioned that to say that is one, that's another way we recognize that these experiences are spiritual or that they're supernatural. But it seems like, if I think about it that way in terms of that ubiquitous quality, that they all seem to talk about love, it seems like God's purpose for them is to give us a message or to inspire us to act in love, right? So, that seems to me to be kind of why God does it. And if I think about it from that perspective, can I now explain this occurrence, right? Well, I feel like I kind of can, right? I feel like I can do that, because if God's purpose is to help us to obtain or act in love, right? To have a greater motivation and inspiration to act in the highest form of love, well, it doesn't really matter what religious figure is delivering that message, right? Who cares, right? It could be anybody. It could be our best friend. It could be a family member. Sometimes people see family members in these experiences. It could be God, or it could be a religious figure. It could just be a white light, right, with no real name or whatever, right? Who cares who's delivering the message if that's your underlying goal? So that alone seems to be the answer to this question, right? Why are religious experiences different? Because what God's purpose is not limited by who's delivering the message. Who cares, right? If anything, that might even be important if you want people not to think of religion. And by the way, that is what all near-death experiences say, right? As far as I know, most of them say, or the ones that talk about it, I should mention, they all say religion doesn't matter, right? Even the Christian ones say religion doesn't matter, right? And that's another thing. Atheists will say, well, if someone sees Buddha, right, in their near-death experience, that's proof that Christianity is wrong. Why? Right? The Christian near-death experiences say religion doesn't matter. You just made that condition up randomly out of nowhere, as always, right? And some of them, I remember I was talking to some of them, they would say, oh, this person, when a person has a spiritual experience, let's say with Vishnu, then that experience is saying, or it's like they're being told that Christianity is wrong. I'm like, no, why would they say that, right? And I asked this person, I was like, show me all these near-death experiences, because we were talking about near-death experiences specifically. I was like, show me all these experiences, like tell me them that said this religion is wrong, right? And this person didn't realize that they don't say that in these experiences at all. They virtually all say religion doesn't matter. And so that's consistent with this idea that religion, that maybe it's not really that important who's giving the message, as long as the message is received, right? The message to act in the highest expression of love, right? Now that might seem to be a decent satisfactory answer for the moment, but we know that there's a little bit more to it than that, right? Because the near-death experiences, they don't just give messages about love, they do tell us about other things. In some cases, many cases actually, they talk about metaphysics. So I actually mentioned some. So with Penny Whitbrot, with I'm blanking on her name. There's Carrie Cohen, and then another one. Oh man, I can't believe I'm forgetting her name. I always mention her name. Betty Eady. I can't believe I forgot. But yes, Betty Eady. So I believe she talked about it in her near-death experience too. So they talked about the nature of thought, right? How thoughts affect reality, and how they affect the metaphysical realm, and how reality forms, and things like that. Basically everything we talked about. They talk about that a lot. So they're talking about metaphysics. So to me, it seems like God wants a little more than to just talk about or inspire us to love, right? He's inspiring us for more things, right? Love is part of it, yes, but there are more things. It seems like, at least in this case, he's inspiring us and motivating us to study metaphysics or understand more about it. Now, he can obviously just give us all the information all at one time, but it doesn't seem like that's his goal, right? He wants us to chase that information and grow or evolve, right, by gaining that information. And so when I think about it from that larger perspective, so it's not just that these experiences are teaching us, are giving us messages about love, they're also giving us messages about metaphysical science, right? And when I think about it more, and I think about other things that we tend to often hear in these experiences, it feels to me like what God is looking more so to do is inspire us to chase truth, right? And that's basically what this third point is about. It says the purpose of NDEs and spiritual experiences is to help humanity obtain greater truth, right? Now, truth, we talked about what truth really is, right? What truth really is, if we use it we define it in a way it's often used in everyday language, right? It's just saying something saying something you honestly believe that matches onto reality, right? So if I say it's, 100 degrees outside, if it's actually 100 degrees outside, then I told the truth, right? But truth is, we talked about it in chapter, I think, 4, right? Truth is more than that. Truth is the unchanging nature of reality that represents the character and the nature of God, right? It represents the eternal bias that God always had forever, right? Eternally, right? Before time was time. I always like to think of God as existing in a timeless space, right? So he was never created, he had no beginning, right? And but he also always had an eternal bias of some kind. That bias is what makes it unable for him to lie or deceive others, right? But so what God is eternal truth, and what God is all truth. Now you might also say he's all love and he's all joy or happiness or peace. And when it comes to the most pure essence of these things, these are all basically equivalent definitions of God, really. That's how I see them. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on truth specifically in the way we interpret truth. And that basically just has to do with the sort of nature of reality, right? The unchanging nature of reality. And so that's the purpose, the underlying purpose of these experiences, as I've come to see it, right? God uses spiritual experiences and near-death experiences to help us, right? To help us to obtain higher levels of truth and understanding, which also means acting in greater expressions of love, right? So he's helping us. In other words, God has a goal for humanity, which we're actually going to talk a little more about that later in the chapter. But God has a goal for humanity, right? And he doesn't just sort of step aside and hope for the best that humanity reaches that goal. No, he guides us, right? So he keeps his, as I like to say, he keeps his finger on the scale a little bit, right? He keeps his thumb on the scale to ensure that we're evolving, right? He doesn't just sit back and hope that we evolve, and if we don't, well, it's on us, right? No, he helps us. So he has a guiding hand on humanity to kind of get it to evolve and move in that direction. It's kind of similar to entropy. So this is almost like a divine form of entropy, right? So with entropy, we know a system, if a system has greater organization, it's always sort of gradually moving toward a state of less organization, right? So it's breaking down. It takes a lot of energy to have a system more organized. Since energy is always moving from a state that has a higher concentration to it, well, concentration is not exactly the right word, but I think you get what I'm saying. Energy always moves from a state that has more, from some system that has more of it to a system that has less of it. If it's constantly doing that, then because systems in general require more energy to maintain organization, it means that reality or systems reality are constantly breaking down to simpler states because they're constantly losing energy. So that's basically a rough description of entropy. And we kind of see something similar. I believe there's something similar in society as it relates to God, right? God is like a divine force that ensures humanity will evolve, whether it wants to or not, right? It is going to evolve. There's only one person on the planet who wants to evolve, then God's going to let that one person on the planet go, and maybe everyone will. I'm getting a little bit into stuff we'll kind of talk about later. But suffice it to say, I believe that's what God does. But yeah, in other words, humanity will evolve over the course of a period of time, right? And if there are people by a certain time who aren't with that evolution, then they're going to have to go by the wayside. And the people who do want the evolution are going to be allowed, right? But humanity's going to evolve one way or the other. So that's what I believe God's Spirit is, how God's Spirit influences humanity, right? So one of the methods that God uses to help that evolution is to give us near-death experiences and spiritual experiences. So that's ultimately what they're for. When people have these experiences, they're meant to provide them to others as a form of testimony. That testimony helps to inspire others and helps to motivate them to be better and to practice love, to try to gain more truth about the metaphysical realm, and to have a relationship with God, right? So that's what I believe. And so now to go over this next point, it says here that God will always favor absolute truth over relative truth. And basically what I'm getting at there is that I believe that in these experiences, I'm wondering if I should mention this here. No. Yeah, I was going to think about mentioning here. No. But what I believe is pretty much what I said. God will have his kind of thumb on his scale in a sense of all of humanity, and he will kind of ensure that humanity reaches its highest potential. He will aid it to that higher state or push it along. Now, when he's giving us these experiences, right, what I believe is that these experiences will have two components to them. So they're going to have a relative component, which is a component that just kind of reflects our beliefs. It isn't consequential in God's overall goal, right? And then it's going to have absolute truth, right? So it'll have relative truth and absolute truth. The absolute truth is the part that is consequential, right? So, for example, if God says Vishnu to someone and that Vishnu tells that person to practice loving others, right? The practice loving others part is the absolute truth. The relative truth is the Vishnu part. Anyone could have told this person that, right? Now, presuming this is a Hindu, right? Any being, any spirit could have told them that, right? Because this person believes in Vishnu, that's who they saw. Same thing with Buddha, right? If someone believes Buddha can appear to someone. It could literally be anyone. It could be another spirit. It could be an angel. It could be Jesus himself, right? Now, I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. But anybody can basically appear as Buddha to this Buddhist and say, love others, right? And so you can see that there's two components to these experiences. There's a relative component and an absolute. There's a relative component and an absolute component as it relates to truth, right? And so God's purpose can still be sort of satisfied, right? If his goal is to teach us truth, it can still be satisfied if there's relative truth. But it does bring up an interesting question, right? Can we gain more truth and more understanding about the spirit realm kind of with this setup, right? Because this setup is useful for metaphysical truth to a degree, right? If God wants to tell us how thoughts work in the spirit realm or the structure of the spirit realm, sometimes we do get that as well. If he wants to tell us about the nature of what you might think of as the heavenly realms, he can do that. And he can do all of that really without any particular religious figure, right? But if we ask the question, is there more or less truth, or is there an absolute truth, or is it always relative truth when it comes to religious figures, right? So that's an interesting question to ask, right? In other words, does Vishnu have more truth, or is he absolute truth compared to Jesus, right? Or is Muhammad absolute truth compared to Buddha? Is Buddha relative truth, or is Muhammad absolute truth? Right? So that's an interesting question, right? And using this setup, right, can we kind of come up with a way of answering that question? Well, I believe we can. And to go over this next point, it says, spiritually isometric phenomena refers to aspects of spiritual experiences that generally only as commonly reported as they are believed. Right, I kind of messed up the word, right? So this is a concept that I just made up, right? And I know the term isometric is kind of weird in this scenario because it refers to, I think, physical dimensions or measurements. But I just kind of adapted it to a spiritual, a spiritual context. So what is a spiritually isometric phenomena, or a SIP, as I sometimes call it? Well, when I was studying this, right? So I'm studying this and I'm trying to get more truth. So I understand that God's purpose, like I said, is probably to give us these experiences to help us evolve. But based on things I've seen, right, in some of these near-death experiences say different things, I want to get even more truth in them, right? I want to look for even more truth because I want to get to the full truth of reality. Right? So I want to get to absolute truth. Well, one thing that I was thinking about, and this was kind of the overall answer to this question in the beginning. One thing I was thinking about is if there's any type of absolute truth in these experiences or in the spirit realm, and it has to do with the experiences God gives us and why he's giving it to us, I suspect right? And this is a theory, but this is the overall, like I said, the overall answer to the question. I suspect that God will, like I said before, have his thumb on his scale toward truth. And so what I mean by that, he'll have his thumb on the scale for humanity toward truth. And what I mean by that is if God is helping us, right, to have these spiritual experiences, he's not going to allow relative truth to occur equally with absolute truth. So for example, if the relative truth is Vishnu, right, and let's say the absolute truth is Buddha, I don't think God would give these experiences in such a way that Vishnu shows up in experiences equally as much as Buddha or less than Buddha, right? Because then that's either not helping us to really have the truth, or it's actively pushing us away from the truth, which God wouldn't do. So if God's overall goal is to help us obtain truth, then he's always going to ensure that the actual truth or the absolute truth is always slightly favored. However much, right? It may be a tiny bit, but I believe it has to be favored. I believe this is just part of God's character. Like I said, if his goal is to help us obtain truth through these experiences, he's always going to give us a little bit more in some way. He's always going to give us more experiences with the actual truth as opposed to relative truth. Now, what I actually forgot to mention earlier is if God wants to give us absolute truth, let's say Buddha, right, is the absolute truth, right? So he's the actual truth and everyone else is just in people's minds. Why wouldn't he just give everyone a experience with Buddha and then everyone knows Buddha is the truth? Well, there's a problem with doing that too, because it goes against one of God's other purposes, which is for us to evolve, right? It's for us to evolve and figure these things out for ourselves. Now, I'm going to talk about that component more later in the chapter, right? Because there is more to discuss about that. But for the moment, the gist of the answer is that God wants us to evolve. If God was just going to give us, it's like giving someone the answers to the test, right? You don't want to do that, right? So if you're training someone and you want someone to pass a test and learn whatever so they can pass the test and understand it, you don't want to just give them all the answers. You don't want to, when they're taking the test, just give them all the answers. Like, no, that isn't what God wants. So if every near-death experience talked about Buddha, and if Buddha was the actual absolute truth, then we would just know, like, oh, Buddha's the truth. We wouldn't have learned of that truth through our own efforts, right? So God doesn't want that. So I believe that God kind of works in between absolute truth and relative truth. There's a balance. There's a proper balance that has to be maintained between the two for those two ends, right? So on the one hand, he has to favor absolute truth to some degree. So he's always going to favor that a little more. And if he doesn't, then we're going to be too confused, right? If relative truth shows up just as much as absolute truth, we'll be confused because they're equal, right? We won't know what the real truth is. Or if relative truth shows up more than the absolute truth, we'll especially be confused because we're going to think that's real, right? And this is coming from God. We trust him, right? So I believe God will always favor the absolute truth, so it shows up just a little bit more than relative truth. But it won't show up so much that we can't evolve on our own and we're just given all the answers. So there's a nice, median sort of position that God is in, right? And I believe that because God will always favor absolute truth to a degree, there should be certain experiences in these near-death experiences and spiritual experiences. There should be certain aspects of them that show up all the time, right? Because God's favoring them. And the fact that they show up all the time means they're going to show up in a way that's not simply, doesn't correlate to show up as commonly as people just believe them. Because relative truth is just a reflection of people's beliefs. You're only going to see that in the cases where people believe something was true, right? So Buddha, for example, usually I'm only going to see him if I believe him. I'm not going to see him if I don't believe him. I don't know who that is, right? Because that's relative truth. God doesn't put his thumb on his scale to give you that truth because it's relative. So you're not going to see it show up all over the place. The absolute truth, you're going to see it show up all over the place regardless of what you believe in because it's absolute truth. It doesn't depend on what you believe in, right? I see truth of reality. So this is kind of how I analyze things, and this is what I believe to be the overall answer to this problem of relativity, right? So if the spirit realm, if these experiences change according to our beliefs, there should be certain components of them that don't change at all, or not at all in terms of every experience, but they're much more commonly reported, and they're reported in a way that has nothing to do with a person's beliefs. That's what I believe is the fundamental answer to trying to analyze his experiences in a way that's not dependent on the observer. So similarly what's done in special and general relativity. So spiritually isometric phenomenon are phenomena that occur only as much as they're believed. So that's basically the relative truth. And non-spiritually isometric phenomena are, spiritually non-isometric phenomena are phenomena that don't occur only as much as they're believed. They occur more often, right? They occur whether you believe them or not, and they're going to keep occurring, right? They've been occurring probably since the beginning of time, and they will keep occurring regardless of what religion people adopt or what they believe in or anything, right? Whether they want something to be true or not, it makes no difference, right? You're going to see this in spiritual experiences, and in that sense, it's not spiritually isometric. It doesn't equally occur. It doesn't occur equally with relative truth or things that people believe in. So an example of that is actually to go over this point, and so I call this SNP, right, or spiritually non-isometric phenomena includes life reviews, just as an example. So in life, so when people have near-death experiences, they have life reviews. They review the whole life. It's funny, just today, I saw this, there's this atheist online who said that he had a near-death experience and he started seeing all these sort of experiences from the time when he was a kid. He was like, you know what? I don't think my brain, I don't think my brain would just randomly do that out of nowhere. It doesn't seem like this is a phenomenon for my brain, because that's what he thought, because he was an atheist, right? And as usual, when he has the experience, he realizes, oh, that doesn't make any sense, right? Because of course it doesn't. And I know there are atheists who have near-death experiences or still maintain their atheism. Some people are very deep in denial, right? But a lot of them, for the ones that aren't, right, many of them realize, and they all say the same thing, like, oh, I was kind of delusional, right? Which is kind of what I said. But anyway, going back to this, right? So people have life reviews. They review their life. Now that occurs so commonly, it is so commonly reported in near-death experiences that it doesn't seem to matter what you believe in, right? People experience that in almost any religion, some form of that. Who cares what you believe in, right? Now I know there are some slight differences between Eastern near-death experiences and Western. I know they don't quite have them as often as Eastern, if I remember that correctly, but they do still experience them to a degree, right? So these life reviews seem to be something that's completely independent of your beliefs. It's independent of your religion. Let's say you believe you won't get a life review. I suspect you would still have a life review, right? Doesn't matter what you believe in, right? So this seems to be a spiritually non-isometric phenomenon. And then heaven and hell, right? Again, doesn't matter what you believe in, how you are living your life, when you have a near-death experience or spiritual experience, you can have one of a heavenly realm or a hellish realm, right? If you believe there is no hell, which is generally true of the atheists, they still experience hell, right? So it makes no difference. It doesn't matter what you believe, right? So this is spiritually non-isometric. It does not occur in as much as people believe it, right? So this, I imagine, is the absolute truth of reality. And God constantly gives us experiences about this. Sometimes they're Christian, sometimes they're not. But they still exist in some form or another. A lower realm or a dark realm than a light realm with love and peace and kindness and things like that. So because it shows up in a spiritually non-isometric way, we can assume that this is a truth of the spiritual reality, right? That's how I think of it. The higher self, right, is another one. The higher self is talked about all the time in spiritual experiences, not as much as life reviews, but it shows up over and over and over and over again, right? It doesn't matter whether you believe in higher self or not. People in your demographic group are going to have experiences about the higher self in their near-death experiences. And so this tells me this is a absolute truth of reality, right? It's spiritually non-isometric. And the last one, and the most important one, is Jesus Christ. So we actually talked about this in chapter 2. Jesus is a spiritually non-isometric phenomenon, right? In other words, he's reported in a spiritually non-isometric way. In other words, and atheists say this all the time, right? They say, oh, Christians in their experiences, they see Jesus because that's who they believe. Muslims see Muhammad because that's who they believe. Hindus see Vishnu because that's who they... No, because it sounds so equal, right? It sounds like, if when Christians have near-death experiences, they see Jesus equally as much. Now, I should mention that many near-death experiences don't have any religious figure. But in experiences that do have a religious figure, or sometimes I call them a religious affirming experience, right, because it affirms some religion. In the experiences that do affirm a religious figure, they make it sound like Christians will see Jesus equally as much as Muslims see Muhammad, and Muslims who see Muhammad will see him equally as much as Hindus see Vishnu. So it all sounds like this equalness. No, right, it's not equal. That would be an isometric phenomenon then, if it occurs equally like that. Jesus is absolutely not spiritually isometric at all, and it's not even a little bit close, right? And you can look this up, right? It's very easy to sort of see this. And if you expand the scope beyond death experience and just talk about spiritual experiences in general, Jesus is reported in spiritual experiences exponentially way more than any other religious figure in the world, on the planet. None of them are like a little, it's not like touch and go and Jesus has a little bit more. No, it's not even a little bit close at all, right? Jesus is reported way more often, right, than any of them. And it's not like he's just reported more often among Christians, right? He's reported way more for Christians than Muhammad is for Muslims. No, like we don't even have to do that, right? We could say every religion, what religious figure appears commonly to all religions, right? It's a complete free-for-all, right? In other words, how often do all religions see Jesus? How often do all religions see Muhammad? How often do all religions see Buddha and whatever, or Vishnu? I could keep going. If you look at it like that, all the religions see Jesus, period. Almost none of them, even among their own religion, according to my research, right, Muslims very rarely see Muhammad. Sometimes they do, but it's very rare, right? Buddhists very rarely see Buddha, right? Hindus do see Vishnu a little bit more than the others, but definitely nowhere near as close to how many people see Jesus, right? I would imagine more people, that, to be fair, I didn't do the exact research. I'm seeing like more, I've seen data points that just are kind of an aggregate. Well, then many near-death experiences aren't religious affirming at all. But I imagine, well, I definitely know it's true for Buddhists and Islam. Way more people see Jesus, right, than they see Muhammad or Buddha, right? And I believe it's the same thing for Hindus. They see Jesus way more often than they see Vishnu. Now, they do see Vishnu a good chunk. That's the only one that they see it a little more. But I still think, if I had to guess, I should have done the research, but I believe they still see Jesus more than they see Vishnu or whoever, right? And so Jesus fundamentally is established according to reporting data as a spiritually non-isometric phenomenon. It's almost like he's absolute truth, right? Because it doesn't matter what you believe, right? You're going to see him, right? Or your demographic group is going to have an experience with him because he's actually true, right? He's not a figment of your imagination. He doesn't only show up in as much as you believe him, right? Oh, no, the other religious figures do. They only show up to the degree that they're believed. Very rarely, I don't know it's ever been reported, at least I haven't really seen it, of Vishnu appearing to a Christian, right? Or showing up in their dreams, like, oh, who's this figure? Oh, my name is Vishnu. Right? That happens all the time with Jesus, right? He shows up in other people's dreams and their spiritual experiences. And by the way, I forgot to mention demons as well. People who get into witchcraft and New Age and they start dealing with demons, it's almost always Jesus who saves them in terms of religious figures. I don't know that I've ever heard of another religious figure from a major religion, or any other religion really, saving someone. No, that's not fair. I have heard of it's kind of crazy, I've heard of an experience with someone who saw Anubis, right? So, very rare, right? And I can kind of go into that explanation too. Could have just been deceiving that person. But in terms of religious figures, right, of the prominent religions, the only one who's really mentioned and consistently involved in saving people from demons is Jesus, right? Demonic entities, they always sort of attack Christians. Like I said, Christians are the biggest punching bags for demons, right? They don't really seem to care that much about any other religious figure, right? They just, like when you anytime you see them attacking a religious figure or having someone engage in blasphemy, someone who's possessed, it's always toward Jesus, right? And you can see it in Hollywood. And it's just all over the place. Like, I was even watching like this documentary called, I think it's God Code, right? And it talks about someone who discovered something called the Bible code, right? And even he had certain, it's like he had certain, his family setup was very similar to someone who I think had a similar name to someone in the Bible. And he started noticing all these kind of messages hidden in the Bible, and so on and so forth, right? So I'll probably talk about that one day, because I believe that also demonstrates the truth of Jesus Christ. And some people will say, well, no, if you have a book very big, it has messages like that. And they were trying to show that in the documentary. I'm like, no, right? And they do the exact same thing I talked about in the section on psychic abilities in chapter 2 and 8. There's always some little trick and gimmick they try to surreptitiously sort of sneak in there to make things equal. Right? They always do that when reality always favors the truth of Jesus Christ. They always try to sneak in some little equalizer into data and say, look, they're the same, right? So I noticed that with the God code, right? But I'm gonna, like I said, I'll probably make a video about that one day. It had to do with basically the way they were trying to equalize messages in data. And in the Bible, there was a consistency to the message and the passages, right? I didn't see that with the other one. They just randomly picked passages and randomly picked out a code, right? But like I said, I would need to do more research on that. So, but, there are, even in that documentary, there are mathematicians who said, that pretty much kind of what I said, right? That the probability of these messages just randomly being there is virtually impossible, right? It almost proves the nature of God. And the statistical methods that are being used in other big books that they say are equally the same, they're things they're not doing properly, right? So they're doing it improperly, which is like I said, they always try to sneak some equalizer into to make Jesus equal to everyone else, when over and over and over and over and over again, reality just shows that he's not, right? Because Jesus is a spiritually isometric phenomenon. It doesn't matter what you believe, right? Reality always favors the truth of Jesus Christ, and so does God. Right, and like I said, I've asked God myself personally. Right, I'll talk more about that experience later in the chapter. So I asked God personally when I was younger. So I talked about that one already about 10 years ago. Then I asked God again later when I had reason to, and he told me once again the truth of Jesus Christ very clearly. So that is something we're going to talk about later as well. But so yeah, that's basically just kind of what I want to set up. So this is the nature of spiritual relativity. So my belief is that the spirit realm, right? The spirit realm, when people have experiences in the spirit realm, some of the experience is going to be real, right? So it's going to contain absolute truth, and some of the experience is going to contain relative truth. It's just something in your imagination that reflects your beliefs, but there's a message underlying it. But it could be a story. It could just be, it could be almost a story like a fable, right? The fable with the animals talking to each other, but there's some underlying message. So you can get messages like that as well, right? But in the spirit realm, you're going to get both, right? Some experience is going to have both, right? It's going to have relative truth and absolute truth, right? And to go to this next point, this kind of sets up kind of a more interesting way of, a nice way of kind of explaining it, which is actually similar to what I did before. So to go to this next point, it says the spirit realm functions like complex number space, right? When I say complex number space, I just mean a space where part of the dimension is real. So it consists of a real number that describes reality, and part of it consists of an imaginary number which doesn't describe reality. It's just something in your head, right? And so this is a consistent theme. We've actually used this type of terminology earlier in the book, right? So in chapter 7, right, of book 1, I talked about how when you see a particular arrangement pattern in nature, right, the affinity for your subconscious to have a particular response to that, observing that arrangement pattern, has to do with how much the pattern actually approximates a subconscious form, which is the arrangement pattern that God has assigned, right? And said, when you see a pattern in this arrangement, you will have an easier time feeling this emotion or charging at this frequency, right? So that's the truth component, right? But then your mind can also just charge and alter your perception and see whatever you feel like, right? That's the imaginary components. So in that sense, we see that based on what I see, the way I respond consists of a real component and imaginary component. We talked about the same thing when it comes to psychic abilities. When you're using psychic abilities and trying to sense things through your intuition, there's going to be a real part and an imaginary part. The real part consists of what your spirit is actually sensing about reality, has nothing to do with your beliefs. Then the imaginary part has to do with what you just sensing whatever you believe, right? Or sensing at the level of intuition whatever you believe. So there's a real part and an imaginary part. And I think the spirit realm functions in the same way, right? There's a real part of the spirit realm and an imaginary part, right? And when you're having spiritual experiences, some part of the experience is going to be real, some part of it's going to be imaginary, right? And there's there's, like I said before, there's almost an uncertainty kind of relationship. No, I didn't quite say that with this case, but suffice it to say, there's basically a connection between that which is real, and there's, I should say, a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? A distortion effect, right? I should say a margin of error. That's kind of what I was trying to spit out. So there's always going to be some type of margin of error with these experiences, or some type of distortion effect, because some of it's going to be real and some of it's going to be imaginary. God will enter different, some experiences may have more realness in them, and some of them may have more imagination in them. And like I said before, if God only gave us all real experiences, or I should say, if he only gave us all experiences that had absolute truth, then it's like he's just telling us the answer. But if he doesn't give us any experiences, so that, let's say he doesn't give us any experiences to avoid that, then how is he really, it's going to be harder for him to help us to evolve. So one of the ways he helps us to evolve is to give us experiences. So if he's going to give us any experiences at all, he has to make sure that they don't contain too much truth, so that he's just giving us the answer, and that they don't contain not enough truth, so that he's not, so that would prevent him from actually helping us to evolve. That's how I see it, right? So there has to be a nice balance, and within that balance, right, there's going to be relative truth and absolute truth. So spiritual experiences could be all over the place. You don't know which part of the experience is containing the absolute truth and which part is containing the relative truth. For you, it's just going to seem like the whole thing's true and that's it, right? And so that's how I look at it. And so that's why some experiences might say that, there is no hell, or there is no, they might say there is no hell. Some of them say there is, right? It just depends on your reference frame. That's another way I look at it, which I forgot to mention. When I think of these spiritual experiences, I think of them as almost like mini realities, right? And I kind of get that from the nature of dreams, which I'm going to talk about next video. But I think of them as like mini realities with their own rules, their own properties, and ultimately they contain a certain amount of truth in them, right? I was going to say just like a dream, but I'll talk about that next video. But they contain a certain amount of truth in them, but they're also going to contain a certain amount of imagination. And there are near-death experiences that talk about that as well, where in many near-death experiences they will mention, remember this one where this woman was in heaven, and she recognized that all the people there were sort of seeing something that, it's like they were in their own reality almost, even though she could see them. They were seeing things that were a reflection of their greatest desires and what was best for them, because it's heaven, right? And things like that, right? So that's just how the spiritual realm is. We're used to this realm where everything's fixed, right? Everything's fixed. Doesn't matter what I think or you think, that the thing over there is going to be exactly the same. But I believe the spirit realm is different, right? It's not like that, right? And it makes sense because our perception of reality is very local, right? The further we go away from the normal human perception of reality, let's say we go very small to quantum phenomena, then everything changes. It's not like what it looks like to us here. If I go near the speed of light, everything changes, right? Perception of time and space is completely different, right? So this perception of reality that we have is not the real one. It's like the fake, it's the imitation. It's the one that has less truth, right? If humans could go near the speed of light, or go down the quantum phenomena, or hang out around huge gravity fields, they would get a sense of how reality really functions, right? We don't do that. We're in this kind of bubble. So we think mostly it's atheists, right? But I'll just say people in general think all of reality functions according to this little bubble that we're in. No. And I believe when you get to the spirit realm, you'll see even stranger stuff, right? And in the spirit realm, I believe you can have a whole reality. A person could be inside of a whole reality that they created to some degree, right? And that reality has its own set of rules and its own set of truths, right? And I'll just say for the moment, you do notice this in dreams as well. When you dream, you'll have a whole memory, you'll have a history, there'll be people that you know, right? Like all types of things, right? You'll know you're supposed to do this and that when you've never seen any of that, like in your entire life. How do you know that? Where's that coming from? But if you think of it as a little mini reality where its own rules, its own history, right? People in that reality have their own identities, right? Then you see that this reality has more structure to it, right? Things you say in that reality only aren't true relative to this reality. But the truth had to be relative to something else. It wasn't necessarily absolute, right? So your dream has relative truth. The absolute truth is pretty much God. It comes from God, and it is the truth of God, right? And so when people have spiritual experiences, I believe they're in like a local reality for them. God can enter that reality, and we'll talk more about that next video. But when they have these realities, there's a certain amount of truth in them, and a certain amount of relative truth. Right? So you can say lots of stuff in these realities. It doesn't really matter for the components of relative truth, but the underlying message is always going to be the same, which is it's going to be some message based on love. Right? Now you don't know how much, there will be other things said, but you don't know which component has more truth or less truth, right? And that's kind of the idea, right? Because God doesn't want you to get the full answer just from these experiences, but they do inspire you. And it's just like when I said about the for general relativity, right? If something's moving or accelerating, you want to know if it's accelerating due to gravity or if it's accelerating due to some other force, right? You can't tell. The motion's the same. That's the equivalence principle. There's no way to know for sure. That's exactly how these are, I believe. So if experience says that hell exists, or if experience says that hell doesn't exist, they're really the same thing. It just depends on the perspective that you're looking at it from, or the truth of the local reality that you're in, right? So that's what I believe. I was going to give an example, but no, the video is kind of a little long, so I'm kind of rushing through it. But yeah, so like I said, in terms of the spiritual relativity, two near-death experiences can say ostensibly different things or have different figures, but they can virtually say the same thing. To the observer, it might look different, but they are the same. The truth underlying it is the same thing. Now, an important question to answer now is if the reality is constantly changing and you're getting truth in your experiences that are coming in different concentrations, some experiences may have a huge amount of truth, right? And I believe those are the ones with Jesus, right? So the experiences where people have, the near-death experiences where people are in heaven, right? And they talk to Jesus, like there's this guy who says he spent 44 hours in heaven, right? Ivan Tuttle, I think he saw cities in heaven, right? And they know Jesus. I think those are experiences with the most amount of truth in them, right? And they also tend to be longer. Something I also noticed, right, about near-death experiences in the East and ones not Christian adjacent, you'll notice that they're generally much shorter. So that's what I've noticed. They're very short. They don't go to heaven. Let's say they're Buddhist. They don't go into heaven and see all the Buddhist gods or whatever, right? It's very short. They see maybe a family member or some being of light, and then it ends. It's like super short, right? Not to me. I've also noticed that they're just rarer. They don't happen as often in Eastern religions and Eastern, and a lot of people have trouble understanding, like they should happen equally. They don't. Right? They just don't happen as much in Eastern cultures as Western cultures. And I don't think anyone really knows why that is. I don't think it can be explained in terms of medical science, because we don't know, there's no medical sort of predictors of who's going to have a near-death experience at all. So the reason that might be the case is because those people are just at lesser degrees of truth compared to Western religions, because they're more Christian adjacent. They're more closer to the truth of Jesus Christ, right? So yeah, that's what I believe. Again, some people might not like that, but that's what the data shows. John Burke, I forgot to mention, is another person who's kind of done the research and has kind of shown some of this that I'm saying about Jesus Christ. And other organizations have too, right? Because it's obvious. If you do the research, it's pretty obvious, right? That Jesus Christ is the truth and Jesus Christ is King. What else did I want to say? But yeah, that's just what I wanted to mention. I want to get that off the way, that in many Eastern religions, like, yeah, they tend to be very short. They don't, they do see their figures, right? Or in Wiccan religions, because sometimes they have near-death experiences too. But they're very short. They're not very profound. They don't see God that much, right? In terms, some of these religions will see God, but in terms of seeing a religious figure, it's a very short experience. Not much is going on, right? There's not even much to report, and they don't happen that often. With Jesus, they happen all the time. They're very long. They're very in-depth, right? There's a lot going on with them, right? So there's another consistency. It seems as though near-death experiences that have more truth, it's possible that for them to be a lot longer than the other ones. That's not always the case, but there does seem to be some degree of correlation based on my research. So, just to go over these last couple of points real quickly, it says NDEers often make claims regarding knowledge that was not directly told to them during the near-death experience, during the reported experience. So, what I'm getting at there is this is something I've also noticed, so this is something important to recognize when you're looking at near-death experiences that tend to seem to be different or seem to be contradictory. I've noticed this, like I've seen it enough times. When many people have near-death experiences, they will see the love of God, which is amazing, right? And they'll start saying things that, at least according to them, was not told to them in a near-death experience. They're just kind of making up their own thing, right? I've seen that so many times. I'm like, that wasn't said directly to you. They'll just start saying stuff, right? And I understand that there could be a temptation to do that. Like a lot of people, when they feel the love of God, it's so amazing that they just say there is no hell. There can't be a hell because this God is so loving, right? And I've experienced that, so I know what they're talking about, right? I've had a dream one time when I felt the presence of God. It was unbelievable. It was awesome, right? And the thing about God, which is kind of interesting, is like, for a moment, you'll feel like he's over here, because that's where you like sense his presence. But then when you look there, it's like you get the sense he's also over there, and over there too. So you look there, now he's like here at the same time. So like sometimes I think he just lets his presence be known like that. His presence is everywhere. Like you can't contain it in like a spot over here. He's everything. He's all over the place, right? Or he's everywhere. So that's what I felt in that dream. But it was an amazing feeling. And it's like when you're in God's presence, like it's hard to even think a negative thought. Like his presence is too powerful and it's too pure. It's like it pushes your negativity back. It causes you to change to his nature, which is to not think negatively. That's what it felt. That's what it felt like. I felt that twice. From 2 times, I felt his presence in my dream. And so I didn't feel any judgment. That was the same thing with Jesus. So I get what people, I felt that with Jesus as well. So I get what people are kind of saying when they have these experiences where they're like, they start to say things about God or say things about the metaphysical realm, and they say there's no hell and things like that. But I believe a lot of them are just kind of putting their own sort of interpretations, and that's exactly what I was talking about. That's always going to be an issue with spiritually non-isometric phenomena, or SNPs, right? And to go to this next point, it says, hellish NDEs and visions are underreported. So this is another thing, even today. So just today, like on Reddit, I saw this article, this thread where this person was saying how they didn't like how there was so many Christian experiences, Christians basically talking about experiences of visions, talking about hell, and they were saying how, that seems to be trying to keep people in fear and they're trying to control us or something like that. And many near-death experiences talk about love. And I'm like, see? But there's 2 problems with that statement. For one, and I noticed this as well, a lot of the near-death experience channels, they don't, for whatever reason, they don't talk about hell that much, right? I feel it's underreported. They make them all seem heavenly and lovely and wonderful, and that's a good thing. But it should be balanced, right? When God gives these experiences, I believe he would want it to be balanced. That's kind of the idea, right? Because I've seen so many reports say that hellish near-death experiences are rare, but when I really looked into it, I'm like, no, they're not, right? They're really not as rare as they make it sound. And even if they're less reported with near-death experiences, people definitely have them with spiritual experiences in general. And that's very difficult to properly it's difficult to properly analyze that in terms of like a bulk data report. Because a lot of people, they like to look at a report. Well, what authority figure made this report that I could trust their reporting methods, things like that. That's very difficult to do properly with spiritual phenomena because they're not isometric, right? In other words, they don't occur. God doesn't just give certain people who fit these metrics, these experiences and things like that. It happens to everybody. It could happen to a bum off the street, right? How are you going to go to this person and say, well, did you have this experience? He's like, yeah. Could just be lying. You don't know. So what these people who make these data reports, they want some degree of veracity, right? They want to verify these sort of experiences. Should have a good chunk. It should have a high degree of vocabulary word I learned, right? So it should have a high degree of verisimilitude, right? If I'm using that right? You want it to be a good chunk, and you can kind of get that to a degree with near-death experiences, but only to a degree, right? Spiritual experiences in general, if I had some dream, right, then it's going to be very difficult to verify that. And that's why these experiences are difficult to sort of put in a kind of mass report, right? You just have to do your own research. That's what I did, right? And just kind of differentiate between who you believe and who you don't, and that's kind of the best you can do. And when I did the research, 100%, I'm like, yo, there's mad hellish experiences that God is giving people, and some people have picked up on that, right? Some of these channels, near-death experience channels and books, they're massively underreporting the hellish ones. And like, I guess they wanted to convince people that there's just this lovey-doveyness in the spirit realm. And it's good to have that, but it's inaccurate. You do a disservice, right? If you try to convince people that that's all there is. And what these people were doing in these threads, right, the one I was talking about with Reddit, is they're kind of doing what the atheists do, right? They want reality to be whatever makes them feel the best, whatever makes them feel better, right? I don't like being in fear, right? I don't like knowing, right, that my actions have consequences, which is also what's said in near-death experiences. I don't like knowing my actions have consequences. Like I said, one of the fears of atheism is the fear of morality according to God's standard, right? So I'm just going to make up whatever I want to be true because it makes me feel better, right? No, right? You don't want to do that. God is telling us what the conditions are. It's up to you if you want to. You have to play by his rules, like you got no choice. So it's up to you if you want to sort of listen to that or not listen to that, right? So I just kind of thought that was important enough to say, right? Even I remember there was this guy who had a pre-birth experience. I think his name's like Howard something, right? I believe. And I believe he actually saw hell. Some people have pre-birth experiences. And the last thing actually I should mention about that is that what near-death experiences also show us, and this is really Christians, if we're looking at purely spiritually non-isometric phenomena, so ones that are reported all the time regardless of what you believe, it tells us that there's more going on spiritually than just what we kind of hear in the Bible. The Bible gives us a good chunk, right? But there's more out there, right? There's more out there going on, and God tells us about some of it. But he wants us to get to this truth, right, in the process of evolving. Right, one thing I actually forgot to mention is that the spirit realm is constantly changing, right? And there's different degrees of truth. Some experiences have more truth, some experiences have less, right? How do we really know what's true if it's always mixed in with some type of relative truth just based on what we believe? Well, there's actually an answer to that, and that actually has to do with another metaphysical law, which we're actually going to talk about later in the chapter. So I just wanted to mention that. The last thing I'll mention here, because again, it's a long video, is that NDEs and visions can also be fake, right? And that was a tough one for me to swallow, because you probably hear that, especially in Christian community, we hear that near-death experiences are fake, or they're caused by demons or things like that, or they can be caused by them. For me, this was actually something God showed me directly, and I wasn't even I was thinking about the answer to a particular question. Right? I didn't pray to God and ask about it, but I just had a dream and he showed me it, right? So I'll talk more about how that works in the next video. But he actually gave me a dream that was showing me, yes, right? He showed me that the fallen angels, there are ones that specialize in deceptions like that. So they can give people fake near-death experiences and can even replicate the feeling of love, which I didn't know. That's amazing, right? I felt like in these experiences, you feel so safe, feeling like, okay, the demons are just going to project negative energy and the angels will project positive energy. No, they can project, I don't think they can project the exact feeling of God. They can project something similar. If you don't know God, you might be tricked by that similar feeling. So I was like, man, that sucks, right? So how can you possibly know? How can you trust anything? Well, you can, and that has to do with pretty much going to be the last metaphysical law we talk about, right? Because there is an answer even to that, right? But again, that was something God showed me. And so you can't, so that we don't really know which near-death experiences are completely faked. He told me, God showed me that the atheists, I think, are probably more prone to the fake ones. And what's the other thing I want to say? Oh, God also showed me that a lot of near-death experiences say there is no hell. He said that those ones, the ones that just sort of assert that there's no such thing as hell, that's just not happening, right? That it doesn't exist. He told me that not to really believe those ones either. That was like the gist of kind of what the message I got. It was also in a dream. So that was God telling me that directly. So, and it's hard to hear that, right? Because it's a tough thing to accept that there is a such thing as hell, but there is, right? And God tells us that all the time. It's a completely spiritually non-asymmetric phenomena. It doesn't matter whether you believe it or not, right? It's going to show up whether you like it or not, right? Or it's reported, right? So you want to make sure you're doing what you're doing, not to go there. Now, well, there's more to talk about, because just trying to avoid there is not how you avoid going there. If you're just doing enough to try to avoid going there, then you probably will go there, right? But we'll talk more about that later. But I thought that was important enough to mention. So yeah, that's it. So that's basically the law of spiritual relativity, right? I don't know if I explicitly mentioned. It's basically the law that says the spirit realm changes according to what you believe, but it has different concentrations of truth and imagination, or different concentrations of absolute truth and relative truth, which is just what you believe, right? Any experience you have, I like to think of as being in a local reality, right? And that reality has different rules and different aspects of what organizes it, including belief. It can have a different history, right? It can have all those things just in that little mini reality, which to us would be almost like a dream. But I think in spiritual experiences, like near-death experiences, we'll talk about more about it in the next video. But I think it's has much more absolute truth than relative truth in dreams, right? Than dreams do. But yeah, they follow different rules. They have different combinations of absolute truth and relative truth. And so you have to think of all the answers you get from near-death experiences. You have to take them accept them with some degree of relativity, right? Don't try to interpret them in a completely absolute way, taking at pure face value what it's saying and accepting as absolute truth. Like I said, when you're in a dream, anything that happens in a dream is only not real relative to this reality. And that reality is completely real, right? So if you were God could give you a message, he could give you a message relative to the truth of that reality, right? So truth is always relative. So that's something that, I just wanted to mention, and that's how you kind of interpret near-death experiences. Now, like I said, later we're going to talk about how the proper way to attain absolute truth, right? It's not through near-death experiences. They were never meant for that. That's what I believe. So yeah, that's it. In the next video, we're going to talk about dreams, and it's going to kind of be an application of these ideas. But yeah, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.